History is littered with dictators and despots of every description, but the 20th century gave rise to an altogether new form of tyranny, the modern totalitarian state. For Europe in the 1930s, totalitarianism thrived as a perceived antidote to the ills of the Great Depression. Italy saw the rise of Benito Mussolini and his gang of fascists. Spain saw the rise of General Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union felt the brutal grip of Joseph Stalin. But it was in Germany that the role of the truly modern dictator was forged. The young leader of the National Socialist Party dedicated himself to the methodical, ruthless elimination not only of all political opposition, but of the very machinery of government itself. And this would all be merely a prelude to the most infamous of horrors, the Holocaust. For Germany did not become a dictatorship overnight. Instead, she slowly sank into totalitarian dictatorship in stages. Some of these involved classic examples of political treachery. Others were less subtle. Gradually, irrevocably, the German democratic state was systematically eroded as the last vestiges of personal freedom were wiped away. One man presided over the destruction of liberty in Germany and would eventually plunge the human race into the nightmare of World War II, Adolf Hitler. Germany turned to Hitler in the 1930s as it sought a way out of the devastating economic collapse that had ravaged the worldwide economy. Europe, and Germany in particular, was hardest hit, and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, imposed by the Allies on Germany at the conclusion of World War I, made life even more difficult for the average German. As the times became more and more desperate, radical solutions were being offered to populations who had seen the politics of the previous generations fail miserably. It was in this climate that a young Austrian, an ex-corporal and failed painter, author of a deranged, self-absorbed political tract, rose to prominence as the head of the National Socialists, or Nazi Party. But how was it possible for the leader of a fringe radical regional party to not only assume the mantle of power, but once assumed, to destroy the very principles of democracy that allowed him to gain power in the first place? The tools and tactics that Hitler used to cement his hold on absolute power would be echoed again and again, when his field of conquest was not just the German political landscape, but the very landscape of Europe itself. Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. 4 weeks later, the new Chancellor used the suspicious circumstances of the Reichstag fire to declare a state of emergency and ban the Communist Party of Germany, along the way removing most of the human rights provisions of the 1919 Weimar Constitution. But for Hitler and his chief lieutenants, Göring, Himmler, Hess, their opportunity to wipe away the last vestiges of the state came from within the Nazi Party itself. Ernst Röhm, a battle-scarred World War I veteran, was the leader of the SA, or Sturmabteilung, a gang of jackbooted thugs who had helped Hitler's National Socialists into power. Hitler was all too happy to use Röhm and his SA when it suited him, but once he had assumed power, his former colleague had effectively outlived his usefulness.
Hitler knew that in order to maintain and consolidate control of the state, he had to ally himself not with a bunch of street brawlers from Bavaria, but with the real power in the land, the military power, the German General Staff, which commanded an army of 100,000 men. Historically, they had been a sort of class unto themselves. They were men of wealth and privilege, and somehow they imagined themselves to be the modern-day Teutonic Knights who had their roots in the Middle Ages. Men like Ernst Röhm, on the other hand, were nothing more than a vicious bunch of beer hall thugs. Röhm and other members of the SA had this strange idea that they were going to be able to get rid of the German army and come up with a new revolutionary People's Army, which of course they would command. From that point on, the SA and the German General Staff were on a collision course, and it wasn't very hard to see which side Hitler was on.
There were other problems with the SA. The anti-capitalist rhetoric of some of its leaders rankled rich German industrialists who had bankrolled Hitler's rise to power. In February of 1934, Hitler informed the SA that while their contributions had been invaluable, a modern Germany needed a professional army. A civilian army was not suitable for national defense. Henceforth, the SA's grim duties would be confined to purely internal matters. Hitler forced Röhm to sign an agreement to that effect. Within the SA, however, was an elite unit known as the SS, or Schutzstaffel, personally loyal to Hitler and no one else. Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and other German officers like Hermann Göring began to agitate for the swift removal of the SA, claiming this was absolutely necessary for the security of the Reich itself. As summer began, tensions mounted. Himmler and Göring were spreading the rumor that Röhm was about to overthrow the government in a putsch. But to complete their plan, they needed support from the Führer himself. At dawn on the morning of June 30th, Hitler and his personal bodyguard arrived in Munich. Röhm and the other leaders of the SA were quickly rounded up and arrested. At 10 a.m. in Berlin, Göring received a phone call from Hitler. He issued the code word Hummingbird, which was used to set off a sweeping set of arrests. It was not just SA who were rounded up, but many other political opponents as well. These arrests led to swift executions. By the time an exhausted Hitler arrived in Berlin later that night, the purge was well underway. The exact death toll for the 72-hour murder frenzy is unknown, but estimates range from several hundred to 2,000 or more. The average German had no idea what had taken place, as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels ensured that the news was kept out of the papers. It was not until the night of July 13th, at the Kroll Opera House, that the German people received an explanation of what had happened, according to their Führer. Hitler, flanked on both sides by heavily armed police and SS officers, spoke before the Reichstag for 2 hours. At 8 p.m. he stepped to the lectern. His tone was sterner than usual, giving the impression that he was very much in control. With the skill of a storyteller, he told the crowd his version of the events leading up to the arrests. I gave the order to shoot those who were the ringleaders in this treason. And I further gave the order to burn out down to the raw flesh the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells in our domestic life and of the poisoning of the outside world. As Hitler spoke, he gave the purge its now infamous name, from the lyrics of a popular Nazi song. It was no secret that this time the revolution would have to be bloody. When we spoke of it, we called it the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler then offered his unique and chilling explanation for the string of murders. If anyone reproaches me and asks why I did not resort to the regular courts of justice for conviction of the offenders, then all I can say to him is this: in this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and thereby I became the supreme justiciar of the German people. With that, Adolf Hitler firmly established that he, and he alone, now represented the German state. In a very real sense, he now was a law unto himself. The hand-picked audience rose to applaud enthusiastically.
And then, almost as an afterthought, the real meaning of the meeting became clear: the legalizing of the murders as emergency defense measures of the state. And you know, there was not one word of protest. The legislators had, in fact, enshrined der Fuhrer as the sole embodiment of the law.
As for Röhm himself, he was given the chance to commit suicide in the form of a pistol with a single bullet left for him in his cell. After 15 minutes, however, his time was up.
The SS officer entered the cell, shot him twice, and as he fell, Röhm said, "Mein Führer, mein Führer." And the officer said, "You should have thought of that earlier. It's a little late now."
For Röhm, his nightmare was over. For the rest of Europe, the nightmare was only beginning. On August 2nd of 1934, President von Hindenburg died. Germany fell into mourning. Within the hour, an announcement was made that the office of President was being merged with the office of Chancellor. Adolf Hitler would become head of state as well as supreme commander of the Reich. Now that he had absolute control over the reins of government, Hitler could now turn his attention to other matters. By 1937, Hitler disclosed that it was his unalterable resolve to solve Germany's problem of living space, Lebensraum. Furthermore, the first steps would be the conquest of Austria and Czechoslovakia. After that, the timetable would depend on the circumstances. Hitler maneuvered pro-Nazi Austrian leaders into inviting the German army to cross the border. By March 14, 1938, Hitler himself was in Vienna. The world now turned its attention to Czechoslovakia, which was clearly in immediate peril. The Democratic Republic of Czechoslovakia had been created by the Western Allies in the wake of World War I, but it was hampered by serious conflict among its diverse ethnic groups, including 3 million Germans, primarily located in a western part of the country known as the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was an area now surrounded on 3 sides by Hitler's army. Pro-Nazi Sudeten Germans now began agitating for an invasion. Stories of outrageous acts of Czech persecution began filling the German papers. The full might of the German army seemed poised to attack. On May 20th, 1938, the Czech government ordered the mobilization of reserve troops along the German border. France warned Germany not to intervene. The British and Russians also agreed to live up to its treaties with Czechoslovakia. For a brief time, it looked like the crisis might be averted. But behind the scenes, Hitler made his intentions quite clear.
Hitler's initial plan was to invade Czechoslovakia in the fall, but the May crisis had infuriated him, and by that time, he was quite ready to change the timetable. By May 30th, he had clearly made up his mind to invade Czechoslovakia at the earliest possible moment.
It was at this point that British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene directly. Chamberlain was of the opinion that the Germans actually had many legitimate grievances, and that war must be averted at all costs. Tensions continued to escalate that summer between Germany and the Czechoslovak government led by Eduard Beneš. Chamberlain requested a meeting with the Führer. The two quickly struck an agreement in which the Sudetenland would be handed over to Germany. The Prime Minister returned to London, confident that Hitler was a man who could be relied upon. Meanwhile, Hitler continued his invasion plans in secret. Chamberlain returned to Germany 1 week later to report that the plans to reunite the Sudetenland with Germany could proceed without opposition from the rest of Europe.
Imagine Chamberlain's surprise when he meets Hitler, fully expecting to have an agreement signed, and all of a sudden, Hitler asks him directly, "Do I understand that the British, French, and Czech governments are about to hand over the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia to Germany?" And Chamberlain smiles and says yes. And Hitler says, "I'm sorry, but that just won't do. That solution is no longer of any use."
A devastated Chamberlain returned to Britain, another victim of Hitler's gangster diplomacy. It was now clear that war was almost certain. Chamberlain tried once again, dispatching his advisor, Sir Horace Wilson, to Berlin on September 26th. Hitler, however, was at his most intransigent. He agreed to negotiate with the Czechoslovakians only on the condition that the Sudetenland be handed over within the next 48 hours. That evening, Hitler spoke at the Berlin Sportpalast. And now before us stands the last problem that must be solved and will be solved. It is the last territorial claim which I have to make in Europe, but it is the claim from which I will not recede and which, God willing, I will make good. Hitler started slowly, painting a distorted historical picture of Czech aggression. He then became more animated as he proceeded to attack Beneš.
New notification. DualSense wireless controller battery level is low.
I have made Mr. Beneš an offer, which is nothing but the carrying into effect of what he himself has promised. The decision now lies in his hands, peace or war. He will either accept this offer and now at last give to the Germans their freedom, or we will go and fetch this freedom for ourselves. The Führer then brought forth the specter of prior German humiliation, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. Now I go before my people as its first soldier, and behind me, the world should know, there marches a people, and a different people from that of 1918. Hitler concluded his speech ominously. We are determined. Now let Mr. Beneš make his choice. As Hitler finished and sat down, up sprang Propaganda Minister Goebbels, shouting, 1918 will never be repeated. This brought Hitler again to his feet. Slamming his right hand on the rostrum, he screamed, yes, then slumped to his seat, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, exhausted. The news of the speech quickly reverberated around Europe. In London, the British cabinet authorized partial military mobilization. Chamberlain addressed the British people. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Chamberlain, with the prodding of the French and U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, pressed for one last chance at securing the peace. A conference was to be held in Munich on September 29th, with all the principals in attendance, including Italian leader Benito Mussolini. The fate of Europe was hanging in the balance. As the leaders of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy met in Munich to decide once and for all the Czech question, the first proposal to be considered was one put forward by Il Duce, Benito Mussolini. The plan was to hand the Sudetenland over to Germany immediately, and then to carve up the rest of Czechoslovakia bit by bit. The British and the French agreed to the proposal with few amendments. The four leaders affixed their signatures to the Munich document. For their part, the Czechs and Slovaks had no say whatsoever in the agreement. Chamberlain arrived back in London, triumphantly waving the piece of paper and proudly proclaiming that he had achieved peace in our time. A few British politicians disagreed. Winston Churchill called the agreement a total, unmitigated defeat. On October 1st, 1938, Hitler marched unopposed into the Sudetenland. He said that it was the start of a 1,000-year Reich. Many Europeans were uneasy that this strategy of appeasement would be successful.
It's astonishing in retrospect that anyone could think that this strategy would work, given Hitler's previous behavior. But you must also realize the absolute desperation on the part of the European powers to avoid war at any cost.
The European powers would not have to wait long. Within 3 weeks, Hitler advised his high command that one of their next tasks would be the liquidation of Czechoslovakia. By March 1939, Hitler had maneuvered the Czechs into a corner. Either they accepted German occupation peacefully, or they would be invaded and their people made to suffer. Czechoslovakia capitulated. Hitler entered Prague, and the British and French were left with not much more than issuing weak diplomatic protests. Hitler's grand strategy was becoming clear. Adolf Hitler's speech at the Sportpalast a year before had revealed the tortured logic of a deranged mind, a mind that could twist the facts until they suited his own nefarious purposes. His astonishing ability to mesmerize the German people through the power of his words would end up leading them into an abyss of darkness and horror unmatched in the 20th century. Hitler's thousand-year Reich lasted less than 12. The end came on April 30th, 1945, in a bunker underneath Berlin. The Führer of Germany, the man who in a short period of time had become the state himself in order to achieve unspeakable evil, took his own life. The price for the rest of Europe, over 50 million dead.